when I was a kid, my parents got divorced. I was about 5 years old, and in the Catholic faith, if you have a divorce and then my mom started dating another guy, they got together, it was considered adultery. And adultery is a mortal sin, meaning that she would go straight to hell if she died. And so, growing up, we knew all about this. And my older brother in particular knew a lot, and he would argue with her and tell her sort of how terrible she was. And I would come down at night and listen to their conversations and learn about it. And basically, it undermined our respect for her, our trust of her. We thought that she was a bad person. And when we went to church, she wasn't able to get communion, and she would cry, and we would think, mommy's bad. And her marriage did get annulled, but it was maybe 10 years later, so it took forever, and the damage was certainly done. My dad used religion in custody to make my mom look bad and make us not want to live with her or respect her, and that continued on for a long time. So the adultery thing was sort of the anchor of her terribleness. My father believed that my mom cheated on him, and that my younger brother is not his son. And that was his big secret that he really believed strongly in, and was one of the main motivations for him to divorce her. He always said that she divorced him and it was her fault, but in reality he actually divorced her. And so he lied about that, and he had no intention of getting back together with her, and she didn't with him. But we prayed almost every night for that to happen. He never really corrected that. So just a terribly toxic situation, and a lot of manipulation that went on. So my dad was very competitive and wanted to win custody, but he lost every time pretty much. And we would go in there and we would tell the judge we want to live with our dad, and it wouldn't happen. When I was 10 years old, my mom got full custody, and she took us out of private school. My dad wanted to make a point that it wasn't good for us, so he told me to do poorly in school on purpose to make my mom look bad for custody, and so that we could try to get joint custody again. And it's a lot to think about as a 10-year-old. The difficult part was really executing it, and not necessarily just changing my answers so that I would just barely pass, but I had to explain myself to my teachers and lying to them, and that was the hardest thing. So I told my dad I couldn't do it anymore, and that was it. But it also teaches you an important lesson, which is that it's okay to lie and cheat and whatever, as long as you have a good reason for it. And I think that's a really terrible thing to do, and a terrible lesson, and a really terrible way to parent, obviously. When we were older, my sister, around the same time, my sister decided to live with my mom instead of my dad, and that was a really difficult situation for our family. For her, my dad convinced us to write these letters, and he edited them and told us we had to be more forceful, telling her of our disapproval of her and how she basically was not in our family anymore, and that we were going to treat her differently, and we did. And I definitely feel guilty about that, and of course I apologize to her many times for that. But again, being manipulated into dividing our family in order to show our disapproval from custody and her decision. But my sister was sexually abused. She was physically abused some, and that was some of her motivation around wanting to live with my mom, to get away from that. And it was, she was really traumatized by that. Couldn't remember it for a long time. Obviously didn't want to talk about it, but I think that was really a tough thing, because if she had talked about it and she had been able to sort of understand that it wasn't right, but to forgive and move along would have helped her. She really got depressed, and different medications didn't work, and started using drugs, and that escalated over time, and eventually she dropped out of school. Her story had a nice turnaround. She got clean and met this guy, and they fell in love and had this beautiful baby, Cameron, born the same day as Emma, which is really cool. And but when she got pregnant, they got her off her medication, and her depression started to creep back in. And within a year, they were divorced, and 8 years later, she died from depression. Maybe not 8 years later. I don't remember the time frame, but she died of depression years later. And obviously, very sad to have anybody die from depression. And part of my regret is not telling her about my own struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts. When I was 13, I almost died from suicide. I got in a fight with my older brother, and it got physical, and he's 5 years older, and I was 13, and he won the fight pretty easily. And I grabbed the knife and thought about it for a while, and the police were called, and neighbors and people got on the phone with me, but eventually I decided I was going to do it. And the underlying depression with all the custody battles and everything else allowed me to make that decision. But in that moment, I just felt this incredible emptiness. I made the decision, and then poof, all of a sudden just felt like nothing. And it scared the heck out of me, and I dropped the knife and collapsed on the ground and pretty much just passed out. But I had so much adrenaline going on, so much intensity. I was holding this knife and so tight from the back that it slid open my thumb, and I was bleeding everywhere, and I couldn't even feel it. And that was the first time. The second time, I was about 23 years old, graduated from college, was working way too many hours, 60, 70 hours a week for about a year and a half, no work-life balance at all. Transitioning from college into working life was hard as it was, but the market was doing really terrible, and I felt pretty badly about that. And I was just starting to think, what's the point? What's the point of life? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, sometimes you can arc towards, well, why am I here? Maybe I shouldn't be here. No one's going to care, especially if you're isolated. And even though I was around people all the time, I wasn't having those deeper connections that you need. And so I started to think about suicide, and in the short amount of time that I had as free time, and all sorts of different things I would think about. And this went on for a couple of months, and I was starting to realize it. And I think part of it was separating myself from these thoughts and saying, whoa, that's not okay. Like, you got to get some help. So I started to tell people about it, and I told my best friend about it, and he was shocked, and that felt good. I think he didn't treat me differently. He really made me realize that it was a dumb idea. And sometimes when you think about things in your mind, especially my mind, things can just develop. And when you don't bounce it off somebody else, then those ideas may seem like they're okay, but they're really not. So I made a number of decisions. I went through and made my schedule a lot better and set some goals and tried to develop some of that hope, some of those ideas for the future. And so I wanted to have a girlfriend. I wanted to do this. I wanted that. So I figured out what I needed to do in order to get that. So I wasn't working out as much, and that really helps to fight depression in and of itself. But then just work-life balance and more interaction with other people and being more intentional about it. I mean, as an adult, a lot of times if you're not reaching out to people, then they're not reaching out to you. And so that's just the way that it goes. And you got to be intentional about trying to maintain and keep and move along friendships. And so anyways, I wanted to just get that off my chest and talk about it, because weaponizing religion and Christianity is something that I've dealt with in my family, and it's been very tragic. So don't do it. And I think people using religion in that way is much like the Pharisees, creating all these laws and rules and missing the heart of the connection, the love for others that Jesus really talked about. And so it's painful to think about, but I think part of the therapy is to release some of your emotions and allow you to feel. So don't try to suppress your tears, your sadness, whatever emotions that you have, especially from trauma. Because if you suppress those emotions, then you won't be able to love. You won't be able to connect with people because you're going to be too afraid of the difficulty. And I still struggle with that. I absolutely still struggle with that. So it's a work in progress. And I want you guys to know it's okay to be vulnerable. And it's okay to love. It's not always easy, and sometimes it's awkward. But I hope it encourages you guys to be yourselves and to love one another. And I just wanted to say a shout out to God, because He's been such an important part of my healing process and the love that comes. And thank you, Jesus. Despite the weaponization of religion, I know that that's not you. And even my father had good intentions in many cases, didn't realize the pain that he was causing. So I forgive him, and I try to honor him in a way to know Christ and to not continue on the difficulty that he brought about. So it's not easy to do, and so many people continue on what happens to them. So you got to be intentional about it, and you got to fight it. Thank you guys for the time, and I love you all. Peace.